Section 5, a useful illusion, question mark. So at the end of all these various forms of wholesale deconstruction of our compelling sense of having a personal self, it's fairly reasonable to ask, if no persistent conscious self exists, why do people believe it does? A popular answer is that although an illusion, the self is useful in helping us survive and reproduce. The most obvious kind of explanation is is that having a sense of self benefits the replication of our genes. Quote, Crook, 1980, argues that self-consciousness arose from using Machiavellian intelligence and reciprocal altruism with its need for balancing the trust and distrust of others. In a rather dualistic version of a similar theory, Humphrey, 86, suggests that consciousness is like an inner eye observing the brain. As primates developed ever more complex social structures, their survival began to depend on more sophisticated ways of predicting and outwitting others' behavior. In this, he argues, Homo psychologicus would win out. These and other theories suggest that a complex social life makes it necessary to have a sense of self, to tot up scores in reciprocation, and to develop what psychologists now call a theory of mind. That is the understanding that other people have intentions, beliefs, and points of view, end quote. So is the self simply a benign user illusion? Hofstadter comments that, quote, ultimately the I is a hallucination, and yet paradoxically it is the most precious thing we own. As Dan Dennett points out, an I is a little like a bill of paper money. It feels as if it is worth a great deal, but ultimately it is just a social convention, a kind of illusion that we all tacitly agree without ever having been asked, and which, despite being illusory, supports our entire economy. And yet the bill is just a piece of paper with no intrinsic worth at all, end quote. Similarly, Rodolfo Linus says that the self, like Uncle Sam, is a useful symbol but not a real person. Hofstadter also claims that, quote, I is an outcome, not a starting point. You coalesced in an unplanned fashion, coming only slowly into existence, not in a flash. At the beginning, when the brain that would later house your soul was taking form, there was no you. But that brain slowly grew, and its experiences slowly accumulated, end quote. Hofstadter makes the point that this I, which the brain is creating, has no knowledge of the brain processes involved, quote. But even though it didn't know anything about its brain, that nascent I faithfully followed its brain around, just as a shadow always tags along after a moving object. End quote. The Danish science writer Tor Nørretranders supports this useful illusion view of the self, which he calls the user illusion. This, he says, is, quote, one's very own map of one's self and one's possibilities of intervening in the world. As the British biologist Richard Dawkins puts it, perhaps consciousness arises when the brain's simulation of the world becomes so complete that it must include a model of itself. The user illusion operates with a user by the name of I. The I experiences that it is the I that acts, senses, and thinks, but it isn't. By analogy with a computer, Nørretranders argues that the brain and body contain lots of information that the I is not interested in. As he says, quote, the I can't be bothered to know how the heart pumps the blood around me. Not all the time, at any rate. Nor can the I be bothered to know how an association occurs in me. It is not only the I experienced as our personal identity and active subject that is an illusion. Even what we actually experience is a user illusion. The world we see, mark, feel, and experience is an illusion. There are no colors, sounds, or smells out there in the world. They are things we experience. This does not mean that there is no world, for indeed there is. The world just is. It has no properties until it is experienced. At any rate, not properties like color, smell, and sound. End quote.